Okay, so let's talk about divine providence. This is the idea of whether and how God works in the world. So some theists subscribe to theological determinism. That's the view that God's willing something is necessary and sufficient for that thing happening. So that means really that nothing happens that God doesn't will, and if God wills something, then it happens. So on this view, then, it seems like there's no free human actions, there's no free will. Uh, God wills everything, and what God wills is what happens. So there's not such a thing really as free will, usually on this view. And this is the view that there can't be free will if God determines everything is called incompatibilism. So a lot of theist philosophers instead believe in libertarianism, which is the view that not all events are predetermined by God because this allows humans to have free will. This seems to cause a problem perhaps with God's omniscience or God's omnipotence, but we're not going to get into that too much, though that is a big problem with it. Unpopularly, Derek Perabroom defends the view that God determines everything and humans don't have free will. But this has some odd moral consequences. So since humans don't have free will, they can't be held morally responsible for their actions. So you really can't punish people. There can't be hell. Well, you can't punish people on earth because God causes everything that happens, so people aren't responsible. God is ultimately responsible. So this is he continues the same kind of thing that we saw with some of the free will arguments. God has or some of the arguments against the argument from evil, such that God has a divine plan which we can't understand, and that's why there's bad stuff in the world. There have been some weird theological maneuverings that try to have God be all-powerful but still have free will for humans, and one of them is called Molinism. So according to Molinism, God has natural knowledge. That's knowledge, that's God's pre-volitional knowledge, or knowledge of things like necessary truth. So pre-volitional means before God acts. So before God acts, God knows certain things, like that all bachelors are unmarried, 2 + 2 = 4, stuff like that. Those are just truths that God knows without creating anything. But then there's free knowledge, which is God's knowledge of contingent truths. So Lloyd might or might not be a bachelor. Unmarried men are bachelors, but we don't know if Lloyd is a bachelor before Lloyd is created. And God doesn't either. So then Molinism continues with this idea of middle knowledge, which is counterfactuals of creaturely freedom. So this is a contingent fact about how a creature will act in a particular situation. So if Lloyd are in a certain circumstance, Lloyd would freely choose to love God. So God's middle knowledge is pre-volitional, so God doesn't determine which counterfactuals are true. God could choose to create Lloyd in such a circumstance where Lloyd would choose to love God, but Lloyd's choice to love God would still be free because God is not, in a sense, forcing him to love God, though he's creating him in a circumstance where he's likely to choose that. So William Hasker and some other philosophers argue that even middle knowledge is impossible for God. This is called open theism. So this means that God and nobody else, God as well as anyone else, nobody, including God, can know what free creatures are going to do. So God is taking a risk by creating free creatures since God can't know what they're going to do. How this is compatible with God's omniscience, that's a question that we can argue about, but this is the general idea here. So there's a lot more to this, like I'm really going over it real fast, but this is the general idea of the problem of theological determinism and divine providence.